When we picture medieval peasants, the common image is one of hardship and endless labor. Yet the truth is far more nuanced. These men and women, who formed the backbone of society, endured unimaginable challenges, waves of plague, devastating famines, and the crushing demands of their lords. And still, somehow, they survived. Their resilience was not accidental. It was forged in necessity, in traditions, and in a constant struggle to adapt to a world that was often hostile. Plagues were perhaps the most terrifying threat. The Black Death alone wiped out nearly half of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Peasants had no understanding of germs or modern medicine, but they improvised ways to protect themselves. Some turned to religious rituals, prayers, or processions, believing divine intervention was their only hope. Others sought practical solutions, burning herbs to cleanse the air, isolating the sick in remote huts, or fleeing to the countryside when outbreaks struck towns. Communities formed networks of mutual aid, caring for each other when entire families were struck down. While countless lives were lost, those who survived learned quickly, passing down folk remedies, cleaner living habits, and the importance of avoiding overcrowded places. Famine was another constant enemy. Crops failed due to poor weather, wars, or pests, and peasants had to stretch meager resources to survive. Their diets were simple and repetitive: bread, porridge, cabbage, onions, and, when lucky, a bit of cheese or salted pork. When food was scarce, they turned to foraging. Wild berries, nuts, mushrooms, and even tree bark were used to supplement diets during the worst years. Communal storage, known as the granary, helped villages stockpile grain, though often lords seized the best harvests first. To endure, peasants developed strategies like crop rotation, sharing livestock, and working together during planting and harvest. Survival depended on cooperation as much as on the soil itself. And then, above it all, were the lords. Feudal obligations demanded rents, labor, and taxes, even in years of crisis. Yet peasants were not entirely powerless. Many negotiated with their lords, offering services in exchange for reduced rents or protection during attacks. Others resisted quietly, hiding portions of their harvest, brewing ale in secret, or grazing animals on forbidden lands. Rebellions occasionally erupted when demands grew unbearable, such as the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. But more often, survival was about endurance, finding small ways to maintain autonomy while living under the constant weight of authority. Despite these hardships, medieval peasants built lives filled with meaning. Festivals, markets, and religious celebrations offered moments of joy. Songs, stories, and traditions preserved community identity. Even when death and hunger loomed, their survival was not just physical, it was cultural. A way of holding onto dignity in a world that often denied it. The story of how peasants survived the plagues, famine, and lords is a story of human resilience. They were not passive victims of history, but active participants in their own survival, using resourcefulness, solidarity, and shared determination to endure. And while the great chronicles often celebrate kings and knights, it was the peasants who kept the wheels of society turning, who endured the worst, and who through their survival ensured the continuation of medieval life. For peasants, townsfolk, and even nobles, markets and fairs were the beating heart of medieval life. They were not just places to buy and sell goods, but spaces where communities gathered. Ideas were exchanged, and social ties were reinforced. In a world where most people lived within a few miles of their birthplace, the arrival of a market day or an annual fair could feel like a festival, both practical and exciting. Weekly markets usually took place in town squares or near churches, where merchants set up stalls filled with produce, meats, dairy, tools, and cloth. Farmers brought their surplus harvest, fishermen offered their catch, and bakers sold fresh loaves straight from the oven. The smells were overwhelming, herbs and spices mixing with livestock pens, the sweetness of honey beside the sharpness of cheese. Bartering was common, and coins often changed hands under the watchful eye of local officials who ensured fair weights and measures. Annual fairs were even grander. Some lasted for weeks and drew traders from distant lands. Exotic goods like silks, glass, spices, and dyes amazed villagers who had never seen such things before. These fairs were guarded by charters, granting merchants safety to travel and trade across hostile territories. For many peasants, this was the only chance to glimpse items from faraway kingdoms, to taste new flavors, or to hear tales of distant cities. But markets and fairs were more than economic hubs. They were social arenas. Travelers brought news, musicians entertained crowds, and storytellers spun tales. Marriages were arranged, disputes were settled, and friendships formed over mugs of ale. Children marveled at acrobats and jugglers, while thieves and pickpockets lurked in the crowd, making mischief among the bustle. The church also had a strong presence. Many fairs were tied to religious festivals, with clergy using the gatherings to preach, collect alms, and remind the crowd of their spiritual duties. This blend of commerce and faith defined much of medieval life. Survival of the body was intertwined with care for the soul. Markets and fairs were lifelines for survival, giving peasants access to goods they could not produce themselves and creating opportunities to exchange labor or crafts for food and tools. They brought color and rhythm to otherwise difficult lives, providing both necessity and joy. For many medieval people, the memory of a bustling fair filled with laughter, noise, and the thrill of trade was a reminder that even in an age of hardship, there were moments of abundance and celebration. If surviving everyday life in the Middle Ages was hard, surviving illness was even harder. Disease was everywhere. Plagues swept through villages. Infections spread from simple wounds. And even a fever could prove deadly. With no knowledge of germs or modern science, medieval medicine was a blend of folk tradition, church influence, and early attempts at observation. To understand how people endured, we have to step into the strange and fascinating world of medieval cures and superstitions. Medicine in this era revolved around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed health depended on balancing these fluids. If someone had a fever, it was thought they had too much blood, so bloodletting was prescribed. Leeches, knives, or cups were used to draw it out, leaving patients weaker but, in theory, balanced. Other treatments included purging with strong herbs to clear the stomach, or sweating out sickness in steaming baths. For peasants, doctors were usually out of reach. Instead, they turned to local healers or wise women who relied on herbal knowledge passed down for generations. Garlic, honey, and willow bark were common remedies. Chamomile was brewed for stomach aches. Nettle was used for joint pain, and honey, with its natural antibacterial properties, treated wounds. These treatments often worked better than the practices of trained physicians, though the church sometimes accused folk healers of witchcraft. Superstition played a powerful role. People believed disease could be caused by bad air, curses, or divine punishment. During outbreaks, bells were rung to ward off evil spirits. Incense was burned to cleanse the air, and holy relics were carried for protection. Pilgrimages to shrines were common, as were donations to monasteries in exchange for prayers. In desperate times, communities even resorted to bizarre rituals, like wearing amulets filled with herbs or strapping live animals to the sick, in hopes the disease would transfer to them. Hospitals existed, but they were nothing like modern ones. Most were run by monasteries and served more as places of refuge than centers of healing. The sick were given food, water, and care for the soul, with priests hearing confessions and preparing them for death. Actual medical treatment was secondary to spiritual comfort. Still, these institutions became vital during plagues, offering shelter for the ill and dying. The Black Death tested medieval medicine like nothing before. Doctors wore long robes and the iconic beaked masks stuffed with herbs to filter bad air. Remedies ranged from rubbing onions or crushed emeralds on the skin to drinking potions of vinegar and garlic. None worked, but the attempts show how desperate people were to find answers. In time, survivors developed practical habits avoiding crowded areas, isolating the sick, and practicing rudimentary hygiene that hinted at a slow shift toward better understanding. What is remarkable is not how primitive these practices seem to us today, but how resourceful people were in the face of ignorance and terror. Without microscopes or modern science, they did what they could with observation, trial, and error. And sometimes, their methods like herbal salves or dietary advice laid the foundation for treatments we still recognize. Medieval medicine may appear strange, but it reveals the resilience of ordinary people who clung to hope, faith, and ingenuity in a world where survival was never guaranteed. The struggle to heal was as much a battle of the mind and spirit as it was of the body, and it shaped how entire communities faced the constant threat of disease. When we think of childhood today, we imagine school, play, and gradual preparation for adulthood. But for children in the Middle Ages, life looked very different. From the moment they were born, survival was uncertain, and those who did live faced a world of labor, responsibility, and limited freedoms. Childhood, as we understand it, was fleeting if it existed at all. Infant mortality was tragically common. Poor nutrition, disease, and a lack of medical knowledge meant that many children did not survive their first few years. In some areas, nearly half of all infants died before reaching adulthood, families often baptized newborns immediately, fearing that without the ritual their child's soul might be lost if death came quickly. These fears shaped parental behavior. Some medieval parents hesitated to grow too attached to young children, knowing how fragile their lives could be. For those who survived, daily life began with work. Peasant children were expected to help as soon as they were able. Little boys tended animals, carried water, and helped with planting, while girls learned spinning, weaving, cooking, and child care. By the age of 7, many children were already laboring alongside adults in the fields, contributing to the survival of the family. Play did exist: wooden dolls, carved animals, and games like blind man's bluff offered moments of joy, but leisure was rare, overshadowed by constant responsibility. Education depended heavily on social class. Noble children were raised very differently from peasants. Boys from noble families were often sent away at a young age to serve in another lord's household as pages, beginning a strict training in manners, combat, and chivalry. Girls from noble families were educated in running estates, embroidery, and sometimes literacy, so they could one day oversee households or enter convents. For peasant children, education was limited. Only a small number learned to read and write, usually if their parents had connections to the church. Most knowledge was practical, passed down orally from family to family. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of childhood, from feast days to church teachings. Children were taught early that their lives were part of a divine order. Priests warned against sin, instilled fear of hell, and emphasized obedience. The church also offered opportunities, as monasteries and nunneries accepted children for religious training. For some, this path was one of devotion. For others, it was a way to escape poverty or secure stability. The dangers of medieval life loomed constantly. Disease could sweep through villages, killing children faster than adults do to their weaker bodies. Famine meant that children often went hungry, their growth stunted by lack of food. Accidents were common, falling into wells. Burns from open hearths or injuries from farm tools were everyday risks. Without modern protections, every day of survival was uncertain. And yet, medieval childhood was not without joy or meaning. Festivals provided moments of celebration, with music, dancing, and treats that even poor children could enjoy. Stories and folklore, told around hearth fires, sparked imagination. Seasonal traditions like May Day or harvest festivals allowed children to be part of community rituals, giving them a sense of belonging. Despite hardships, bonds of family and community created spaces where children could laugh, play, and learn. One of the most striking realities is how quickly childhood ended. By the early teens, most children were already taking on adult roles. Girls were often married by 14 or 15, sometimes younger, while boys began working full-time or training for war. Life expectancy was shorter than today, so adulthood came swiftly, and responsibilities arrived early. Childhood was not a separate stage of life, but a brief passage into the burdens of maturity. The medieval world was harsh on its youngest members, but their resilience shines through. In fields, in kitchens, and in castle halls, children learned to navigate survival from their earliest days. Their lives remind us that even in times of hardship, laughter, curiosity, and the bonds of family were powerful enough to persist. The story of medieval childhood is not only about suffering, it is also about adaptation, endurance, and the ability of the human spirit to find light even in the darkest of times. Few figures from the Middle Ages capture the imagination quite like the knight. Tales of shining armor, noble quests, and the chivalric code have shaped our modern image of medieval knighthood. But what was the reality of a knight's life? Beneath the romance of legend lay a world of grueling training, harsh discipline, shifting loyalties, and a lifestyle deeply tied to both privilege and duty. Knighthood was not simply granted, it was earned through years of preparation. Boys destined for this path often began as pages at just 7 years old, sent to the household of a noble lord. Their duties included serving meals, cleaning weapons, running errands, and learning courtly manners, more than just chores. These tasks introduced them to discipline and obedience. They also learned the basics of literacy, religion, and music. Since knights were expected to embody culture as well as combat, around the age of 14, pages became squires, taking on more direct military training. This was the stage where boys began learning the art of war, riding horses with skill, handling lances and swords, and practicing in tournaments. Squires also served their lords in battle, maintaining armor, tending to horses, and sometimes even fighting alongside them. The training was relentless, requiring strength, endurance, and absolute loyalty. Only after proving themselves in combat and service could they hope to be knighted, often in a solemn ceremony marked by vows and blessings. Once knighted, their lives were far from leisurely. Knights were warriors first, called upon to defend their lord's lands, enforce justice, and participate in campaigns. But they were also bound by the chivalric code, a set of ideals emphasizing loyalty, honor, courage, and the protection of the weak. In theory, knights were guardians of morality and defenders of the church. In practice, not all lived up to these ideals. Some knights were ruthless mercenaries, driven by wealth or ambition rather than virtue. Still, the code of chivalry provided a framework for behavior that defined how knights were remembered in chronicles and romances. Knights were also deeply tied to the feudal system. In exchange for land or wealth, they owed military service to their lords. This bond was both empowering and limiting. It gave them status above peasants and common soldiers, but also meant they were entangled in the endless web of feudal conflicts. Wars between rival lords could force knights to fight against former allies, and loyalty was often tested when politics shifted. For many, knighthood was as much about navigating obligations as it was about charging into battle. The equipment of a knight was both impressive and burdensome. Armor evolved from chainmail to full suits of plate, offering formidable protection, but requiring great strength to wear. Horses were equally essential, bred for stamina and power, capable of carrying heavily armored riders into combat. Maintaining this equipment was enormously expensive. Many knights struggled to afford their armor, weapons, and steeds, relying on plunder or their lord's support to sustain their profession. Beyond the battlefield, tournaments became a central part of knightly culture. These were not just sporting events, but serious training exercises and opportunities to win wealth and prestige. Jousting, melee combat, and elaborate pageantry turned knights into celebrities of their time. Crowds gathered to cheer their favorites, and victories could elevate a knight's status dramatically. Yet tournaments were dangerous, injuries and deaths were common. A reminder that the line between sport and battle was thin. Religious devotion was another key aspect of knightly life. Many knights saw themselves as soldiers of God, sworn to defend the faith. The Crusades epitomized this union of warfare and religion, drawing knights across Europe to fight in distant lands under the banner of Christianity. Whether motivated by piety, adventure, or promises of land and wealth, the Crusades shaped the identity of knighthood for centuries, reinforcing the idea that knights were defenders, not only of lords, but of the church itself. Despite their prestige, knights also faced constant peril. Wars were frequent, disease was rampant, and the costs of maintaining their status could ruin families. Not every knight lived in glory. Many died anonymously on muddy fields, their sacrifices remembered only by their comrades. The romanticized image of knighthood often obscures this reality. But behind every legend lies the harsh truth of men who gave their lives to a demanding profession. And yet, the legacy of knights endures. Their ideals of honor, loyalty, and courage influenced not only medieval culture, but also modern concepts of heroism. Even as firearms and new military tactics made armored cavalry obsolete, the stories of knights lived on in literature, shaping how we imagine the Middle Ages itself. The knight was more than a warrior, he was a symbol, embodying both the aspiration and contradictions of his time. While castles, cathedrals, and knights often dominate our image of the Middle Ages, the vast majority of people lived not in fortresses or cities, but in villages. These small, tightly knit communities were the true foundation of medieval society. Life in a village revolved around the rhythms of nature, the demands of survival, and the bonds between neighbors who depended on each other for protection and support. A typical medieval village consisted of clusters of thatched roof cottages, fields stretched out in strips, and a central church that anchored both spiritual and social life. The homes were simple: wattle and daub walls, dirt floors, and smoky hearths where families cooked, ate, and slept in the same space. Privacy was rare, with parents, children, and sometimes livestock sharing a single room. Despite these modest conditions, villages were filled with life, and every member of the community had a role to play. The open field system structured agricultural life. Land was divided into long, narrow strips, and each family farmed several scattered plots. This arrangement ensured fairness, as both fertile and poor soil were distributed evenly. Planting followed a communal rhythm, with crop rotation preventing total exhaustion of the soil. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye formed the backbone of diets, while peas, beans, and cabbage supplemented meals. Livestock roamed common pastures, with pigs rooting through forests and cows grazing on shared meadows. Farming was backbreaking, But cooperation allowed villages to endure hardships that no single family could face alone. The manor lord owned much of the land, and peasants owed him rents, labor, and obedience. Villagers worked on the lords to mend fields several days a week, repairing roads, building fences, or harvesting crops. In return, the lord offered protection, settling disputes in his manor court, and defending the community against outside threats. This feudal arrangement was restrictive, but it also gave peasants a degree of stability in a world full of uncertainty. Many resented their obligations, but few could imagine life beyond the manor's boundaries. Religion permeated every corner of village life. The church was not only a place of worship, but the center of education, record-keeping, and community gathering. Festivals and feast days punctuated the agricultural calendar, giving peasants breaks from labor with music, dancing, and shared meals. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals bound families into the spiritual fabric of the parish. Superstition thrived, alongside faith charms, rituals, and folk beliefs blended with Christianity in ways that gave peasants a sense of control over their precarious existence. Daily routines were grueling. Men plowed, sowed, and harvested, while women tended gardens, spun wool, baked bread, and cared for children. Children joined in as soon as they were able, scaring birds from fields or fetching water from wells. Work began at dawn and ended only when daylight faded. Meals were simple, often little more than bread and pottage, but they provided the energy needed to keep laboring. Leisure was rare, though storytelling, singing, and small games offered moments of respite. Despite hardships, medieval villages were not joyless places. Community bonds were strong, and cooperation was essential for survival. Neighbors helped each other with harvests, shared tools, and came together for celebrations. Gossip, disputes, and rivalries existed, but so did loyalty and solidarity. The shared experience of living under the same lord, enduring the same weather, and worshipping in the same church created an identity that bound villages together for generations. Yet life was always precarious. A poor harvest could bring famine, leaving families hungry through winter. Outbreaks of disease could empty cottages overnight. War brought soldiers who raided crops, burned homes, and forced peasants into servitude. Villages rebuilt after each disaster, but the fragility of survival was a constant reminder of their dependence on both nature and each other. What makes medieval villages remarkable is their endurance. For centuries, they formed the backbone of Europe's population, producing the food, labor, and taxes that supported lords, kings, and the church. While history books often focus on battles and royalty, it was in the muddy fields and smoky cottages of villages where real medieval life unfolded day after day. The village was not just a place of survival, it was the heart of medieval society itself. When most people think of the Middle Ages, castles immediately come to mind: towering stone walls, moats, and high battlements looming over the countryside. Castles were far more than impressive fortresses. They were the political, military, and social centers of medieval life. To truly understand them, we have to peel back the layers of stone and mortar to uncover the secrets of these monumental Structures. The earliest castles were motte and bailey designs. Introduced to Europe in the 10th century, a motte was a large earthen mound, often artificial, topped with a wooden tower. The bailey, a walled courtyard, sat at the base and contained living quarters, workshops, and stables, though crude compared to later stone fortresses. These early castles provided rapid defense. In a violent age, lords could control land, oversee peasants, and withstand raids from rival nobles. Over time, wooden structures gave way to stone. As sieges grew more destructive and attackers devised cleverer ways to breach defenses. By the 12th and 13th centuries, castles became increasingly sophisticated. Thick curtain walls, reinforced gatehouses, and concentric designs walls within walls made them formidable. Defenders poured boiling oil or water from machicolations, fired arrows through narrow slits, and dropped heavy stones on ladders. Moats, whether dry or filled with water, added another layer of protection. Every detail was calculated to repel attackers, turning castles into machines of defense. Yet, despite their intimidating appearance, most castles were rarely attacked. Their very presence deterred violence, symbolizing the lord's authority and power. Inside, castles were more than fortresses, they were homes and administrative centers. The Great Hall was the beating heart, where lords held feasts, dispensed justice, and received guests. Kitchens bustled with activity. Chapels provided spiritual refuge, and chambers offered relative comfort compared to the peasant cottages outside. Life within the walls was stratified. Nobles enjoyed meat, wine, and furs, while servants and guards endured cramped quarters and simple meals, but for everyone inside. The castle walls offered safety in an age when danger lurked constantly beyond the gates. Castles also played a crucial role in the feudal system. They served as administrative hubs where lords managed estates, collected rents, and oversaw courts. They were symbols of dominance, reminding peasants of their obligations while demonstrating the reach of noble power. Yet castles also protected the surrounding community. In times of war, peasants could flee behind the walls, bringing their livestock and possessions to shelter from invading armies. In this way, castles embodied both oppression and protection, both privilege and survival. Beyond their military and political functions, castles were cultural centers. Troubadours sang in great halls, tournaments were staged in surrounding fields, and marriages cemented alliances. Within their walls, some castles became seats of learning and diplomacy, where treaties were signed and strategies plotted. As Europe stabilized in later centuries, many castles shifted focus from defense to comfort. With larger windows, decorated interiors, and elaborate gardens, their role evolved from fortress to palace, reflecting changing priorities in medieval society. But even the strongest castles were not invincible. Advances in siege technology such as trebuchets, mining tunnels, and later, gunpowder artillery challenged their defenses. By the late Middle Ages, cannons rendered thick stone walls less effective. Some castles crumbled under bombardment, while others were abandoned as rulers built more comfortable residences in towns and cities. Despite their decline, castles never lost their symbolic power. Today, Ruins of medieval castles still stand across Europe, silent reminders of their former glory. Some are crumbled mounds of earth, where motte and baileys once stood. Others remain towering fortresses, like the castles of Wales or the Loire Valley. Walking through their remains, one can still feel the echoes of feasts, battles, and daily life that unfolded within their walls. Castles were not just military strongholds, they were living communities, monuments to ambition, and enduring symbols of the medieval world. When sickness struck in the Middle Ages, hope often rested not in science as we know it today, but in a blend of superstition, tradition, and trial-and-error remedies. Medieval medicine is one of the most fascinating and unsettling windows into the past because it reveals not only how people tried to survive disease, but also how they understood the human body itself. At the heart of medieval medical theory was the belief in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, originating from ancient Greek thought. These systems suggested that health depended on keeping these fluids balanced. Too much blood. A physician might prescribe bloodletting with leeches or lancets. Too much phlegm. Hot herbs or spicy foods might be given to dry the system. Though misguided, this theory offered a framework that guided European medicine for centuries. In practice, medical care varied widely depending on social class. Wealthy nobles could afford physicians, trained in universities, who studied Latin texts and prescribed complex regimens of diet, rest, and herbal remedies. Monasteries, too, were important centers of healing. Monks grew medicinal herbs like sage, thyme, and rosemary in cloister gardens, carefully copying ancient texts that preserved medical knowledge through turbulent centuries. Ordinary peasants, however, relied mostly on folk healers, midwives, and herbalists. They treated wounds with poultices, eased pain with willow bark, and used charms or prayers to ward off illness. Superstition and religion played powerful roles in treatment. Many believed illness was punishment from God, so prayers, pilgrimages, and the use of holy relics were as important as herbs or diets. Some wore amulets inscribed with charms to ward off the evil eye. Astrological charts guided medical decisions too, as healers believed the stars influenced the body. A physician might delay surgery if the moon was thought to be in an unlucky position, or prescribe remedies according to zodiac signs. Surgery itself was a brutal affair, performed by barber surgeons rather than learned physicians. Procedures ranged from pulling teeth to setting bones, lancing abscesses, and even amputations. Without anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium, patients endured unimaginable pain. Still, medieval surgeons developed surprising skill. They used cauterization to stop bleeding, employed rudimentary antiseptics like vinegar, and created detailed manuals on treating wounds. Battlefield medicine especially pushed innovation, as constant warfare demanded quick treatment for injured soldiers. Yet the limits of medieval medicine became most visible during times of crisis. The Black Death of the 14th century devastated Europe, killing millions despite desperate attempts at cures. Doctors wore the now famous beaked masks filled with herbs, believing they filtered poisonous air. People carried posies of flowers, burned aromatic woods, or whipped themselves in acts of penance, hoping to drive away divine punishment. Nothing worked, and the plague exposed just how fragile medical understanding truly was. Despite these shortcomings, medieval medicine laid foundations for progress. The careful observation of symptoms, the cataloguing of herbs, and the establishment of hospitals all paved the way for later developments. In cities, hospitals often cared not only for the sick, but also the poor and elderly, offering food, shelter, and basic treatment. Universities began training physicians with more rigor, though their reliance on ancient texts still held back innovation. What's remarkable is how much resilience ordinary people showed. Despite constant threats from plague, famine, and war, they clung to remedies that gave them comfort, whether or not they were effective. Healing was as much about hope as it was about herbs, and in a world with few certainties, that hope mattered greatly. Looking back, medieval medicine may seem primitive or even laughable to us, but it reflected a society doing its best with the knowledge it had. Remedies of herbs, rituals, and humors may not have cured diseases as we understand them, yet they reveal the determination of people who refused to surrender to illness, no matter how great the odds. When we picture medieval warfare, we often think of armored knights clashing in glorious combat. The truth, however, was far more complex and far less glamorous. Warfare in the Middle Ages was about survival, strategy, and control, from the battlefield to the walls of besieged castles. It was a brutal test of endurance and ingenuity. The medieval battlefield was rarely a chaotic free-for-all. Tactics were carefully considered, often relying on terrain, troop formation, and timing. Armies consisted of more than just knights. Foot soldiers, archers, and later crossbowmen and pikemen played essential roles. Knights on horseback were devastating, but they needed support. Cavalry charges often worked best against disorganized troops, while disciplined infantry could blunt even the fiercest mounted assault. Commanders had to adapt quickly or risk annihilation. Perhaps the most decisive weapon of the age was the longbow, famously used by English armies at battles like Crécy and Agincourt. The longbow allowed relatively common soldiers to bring down heavily armored knights. From a distance, crossbows, though slower to reload, could pierce armor more effectively. As these weapons spread, the dominance of the knight began to wane, showing how new tactics could shift the balance of power. Sieges, however, were the hallmark of medieval warfare. Rather than fighting in open battle, many wars revolved around capturing castles or fortified towns. Besieging an enemy could take months, or even years, with attackers cutting off supplies and using siege engines like trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers to break defenses. Defenders relied on thick walls, boiling oil, and sheer determination to hold out. Starvation and disease often decided sieges long before walls fell to stone projectiles. Warfare was also psychological. Displaying banners, horns, and drums was as much about intimidating the enemy as it was about communication. Raiding enemy lands, burning crops, and destroying villages could force an opponent into submission without ever fighting a decisive battle. For peasants, this meant devastation, their homes and livelihoods destroyed as pawns in larger conflicts. Despite the brutality, codes of conduct existed. The chivalric ideal emphasized honor, ransom for captured nobles, and mercy toward fellow Christians. In reality, these ideals were often ignored when survival was at stake, but they still shaped expectations of how warfare should look. Prisoners of high rank could be ransomed for fortunes, while common soldiers were more likely to be slaughtered or enslaved. By the late Middle Ages, gunpowder began to reshape the battlefield. Cannon shattered castle walls that had stood for centuries, making traditional fortifications less effective. Firearms, though crude, gave even poorly trained soldiers a lethal edge. These innovations marked the end of the medieval style of warfare and ushered in the modern era. For the people of the Middle Ages, war was constant and inescapable reality that disrupted every part of life. It was not fought only for glory, but for land, wealth, and survival. Medieval warfare was a test not just of strength, but of strategy, endurance, and the ability to adapt. And while knights and castles may dominate the popular image, the true story lies in the mix of brutal reality and tactical ingenuity that defined this era of conflict. If you were a peasant in the Middle Ages, your survival depended not just on the land you worked, but on the food that land provided. Forget banquets of roasted boar and fine wines that was the life of nobles. For peasants, meals were simple, repetitive, and often uncertain. Yet the diet of the medieval peasant reveals a story of resilience and adaptation in a world where hunger was never far away. Bread was the cornerstone of peasant diets, made from coarse grains like rye, barley, or oats. It was dense, dark, and often gritty with bits of stone from primitive grinding mills. This bread could last days, sometimes weeks, and was eaten with almost every meal. In fact, the word companion comes from the Latin for with bread, highlighting just how central it was to life. Wealthier households might occasionally enjoy wheat bread, but for most peasants it was a rare luxury. Alongside bread, pottage was the daily staple. This thick stew was made from whatever was available: beans, peas, onions, cabbage, or turnips. Flavored with herbs from the garden, pottage simmered all day in the hearth, providing both sustenance and warmth. Meat was rare for peasants, often reserved for festivals or feasts. Instead, they relied on vegetables, legumes, and dairy to sustain them. Cheese, butter, and milk provided vital protein and fat. When available, though scarcity was common, fish played a surprising role, especially in Christian Europe, where meat was forbidden on many religious fasting days. Salted herring, dried cod, or locally caught freshwater fish were common substitutes. Preservation was key. Salting, smoking, and drying allowed food to last through harsh winters or lean years. In some regions, access to rivers and coasts made fish a crucial part of the diet, while inland peasants had to settle for smaller catches. Seasonal changes shaped the rhythm of meals. In spring, fresh greens and herbs brought variety after the bleakness of winter. Summer provided berries and fruits, while autumn harvests filled storehouses with grains, nuts, and root vegetables. Winter was the true test of survival, when stored food had to stretch until the next harvest. A poor crop or spoiled stores could mean famine, forcing peasants to eat acorns, tree bark, or even boiled weeds just to survive. Drink was as important as food. Water was not always safe, so ale was the peasant's drink of choice, brewed at home from barley or oats. It was low in alcohol, but provided calories and hydration. Children drank it as well. Wealthier families might afford wine, but for peasants, ale was daily fuel. In some areas, weak cider or fermented drinks from honey or berries supplemented the diet. Hunger was a constant threat. Bad weather, war, or disease could destroy harvests and lead to famine. Historical records tell of years when peasants starved, selling possessions or even abandoning villages in search of food. For those who survived, meager diets left their mark. Malnutrition, stunted growth, and disease were common. Yet despite this, peasants endured, finding ways to stretch food, preserve what they had, and share within their communities. What makes the peasant diet remarkable is its reflection of the world they lived in: modest, resourceful, and deeply tied to the land. While nobles feasted on exotic spices and roasted meats, peasants filled their bowls with pottage and bread, grateful for whatever sustenance they could gather. Their diet was not glamorous, but it was the foundation of survival in the medieval world. In the Middle Ages, justice looked very different from what we know today. Courts, trials, and punishments existed, but they were shaped as much by superstition, social status, and raw power as by fairness. To understand medieval justice is to glimpse a world where guilt could be decided by fire, water, or the swing of an executioner's axe. Most justice began at the local level, manorial courts, presided over by a lord or his steward, handled disputes between peasants. These ranged from arguments over land boundaries to accusations of theft, drunkenness, or failing to perform duties. Punishments were usually fines, extra labor, or public humiliation. For peasants, even small penalties could be crushing, but they had little choice but to accept the verdict. For more serious crimes, murder, treason, heresy, or robbery, royal courts took over. Trials could be shockingly theatrical. One notorious practice was the ordeal, a way to let God decide guilt. An accused might plunge a hand into boiling water or carry red-hot iron. If the wound healed cleanly, they were considered innocent. If it festered, guilty. Water ordeals tested purity by throwing the accused into a pond. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent but possibly drowned. It was as much superstition as justice. Punishments were harsh, often intended to frighten others into obedience. Thieves could have their hands cut off. Public whippings, stocks, and pillories turned criminals into spectacles of shame. Execution was reserved for the worst crimes, carried out by hanging, burning, or beheading. Nobles might receive the honor of decapitation, while peasants often met slower, more brutal deaths. Justice was rarely equal. Your fate depended on your birth as much as your crime. The church also wielded immense power in matters of justice. Ecclesiastical courts judged clergy and cases of heresy, often with punishments like penance, pilgrimages, or excommunication. But when accused of heresy, punishment could be far deadlier. Burning at the stake was meant to purify the soul through fire. Inquisitions made fear of accusation a constant shadow across medieval Europe. Despite the cruelty, medieval justice served an important function, maintaining order in a world with weak central governments and constant threats. Fear of punishment, combined with community enforcement, kept most people in line. But corruption, favoritism, and violence meant that justice was rarely impartial. The powerful could often buy or bully their way to freedom, while the poor suffered harshly. Over time, some reforms began to appear. Juries of local men slowly replaced ordeals. Written records standardized court procedures, and royal authority strengthened legal systems. These developments laid early groundwork for modern law, though justice remained uneven. In the end, medieval justice was not so much about fairness as it was about survival, about keeping peace in communities and protecting the interests of lords, kings, and the church. It was rough, often cruel, but in a world of uncertainty, it was the only form of order most people knew. Few events in history compared to the devastation of the Black Death. Sweeping through Europe in the mid-14th century, the plague killed tens of millions, wiping out nearly half the continent's population. Entire villages vanished. Cities became ghost towns, and fear hung over every household. Yet out of this unimaginable tragedy came profound changes that reshaped medieval society forever. The plague spread rapidly, carried by fleas living on black rats that traveled along trade routes. Ships brought the disease from Asia to Mediterranean ports, and from there it spread inland with terrifying speed. Symptoms were agonizing: swollen buboes, fevers, blackened skin, and death within days. With no understanding of germs, people blamed bad air, divine punishment, or even foreigners and minorities, leading to violence and persecution. Responses to the plague varied wildly. Some turned to religion, joining flagellant movements that whipped themselves in hopes of appeasing God's anger. Others turned to indulgence, feasting and drinking in the belief that death was inevitable. Physicians tried everything from bloodletting to aromatic herbs, but nothing worked. The plague struck rich and poor alike, though the poor, living in crowded and unsanitary conditions, suffered the most. The social consequences were enormous. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Peasants and workers demanded higher wages, sometimes refusing to work at all. This challenged the rigid feudal system, giving survivors newfound bargaining power. In England, these tensions exploded in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Across Europe, lords struggled to maintain authority as the old order began to crumble. Religion, too, was shaken. The church had no cure, no explanation, and no power to stop the plague. Many lost faith in religious institutions, while others clung to them more tightly than ever. This crisis of confidence planted seeds that would later grow into movements for reform. Art and literature reflected the trauma, with images of death, skeletons, and grim reminders of life's fragility dominating culture for generations. The Black Death also transformed medicine, though remedies failed. The sheer scale of the disaster encouraged closer observation record keeping, and eventually, new approaches to health. Public health measures like quarantine and pest control began to emerge in its aftermath, laying early groundwork for modern medicine. Above all, the plague forced people to rethink their place in the world. Survivors inherited wealth, land, and opportunities that had once seemed unreachable. Entire economies shifted, paving the way for the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of new social structures. In Europe, the Black Death was a catastrophe without parallel, but it was also a turning point. Out of despair and destruction came change, and from change, the beginnings of a new world. Medieval society would never be the same again, reshaped forever by the shadow of the plague.